Hey everyone. For those of you prepping for the RBI Grade B exam,
Yeah,
you know it can be tough to stay on top of all the info the RBI throws our way.
it really can.
That's why we're here to help with this deep dive.
That's right.
We're taking a look at the November 2024 RBI Bulletin.
That's a good one.
Lots of juicy stuff in there, actually,
Definitely.
for the exam, but also just generally for understanding what's going on with the Indian economy.
Absolutely.
So we've got the State of the Economy report,
Uh-huh.
some serious exchange rate analysis,
Important stuff.
and even a look at how the RBI's communication can move markets.
Interesting stuff there.
Should we just dive right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so State of the Economy.
Okay.
This article takes a global view first and
Yeah.
paints a kind of tricky picture.
Mm-hmm.
Global economy is showing resilience,
Right.
but there's also shaky confidence and this rise in protectionism.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's like the global economy is on this tightrope walk, you know?
Oh.
You see some positive signs,
Mhm.
but then these protectionist policies,
Yeah.
it could really throw things off.
And for our listeners who are prepping for the RBI Grade B exam,
Right.
it's worth thinking about how this global uncertainty might affect India's economic strategy.
Absolutely. It's not just about the facts themselves. It's
Right.
about understanding those ripple effects.
Exactly.
How things connect.
Okay, so let's bring it back home to India.
Okay.
Remember that slowdown we had in Q2?
Yeah,
Looks like we bounced back.
we have.
Private consumption is leading the charge.
It is.
All that festival spending really helped.
Yeah, that's always a boost.
So, thinking about the exam again,
Uh-huh.
this rebound is huge,
It is.
especially after that slowdown.
Exactly.
I wonder how things like consumer confidence and
Yes.
inflation expectations played into this.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like a textbook example of how what individuals do
Mm-hmm.
affects the bigger economic picture.
A classic micro to macro link.
Okay, on to financial markets.
Right.
The article says they're feeling some pressure
Yeah.
from the strong U.S. dollar,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a bit of nervousness in the stock market.
Right.
Some foreign investors are pulling out funds.
Yeah, it's making things a bit jittery.
Yeah.
This is where understanding how exchange rates work becomes super important.
For sure.
Something we'll get into more later on.
Awesome.
But for now,
Yeah.
think about this. How might the RBI respond to all this external pressure on the rupee?
Good question.
What tools do they have to maintain stability?
Those are the kind of questions that could pop up on the exam.
Exactly.
Okay, one last thing.
All right.
Inflation.
Of course.
Big topic.
Always is.
And it's still above the RBI's comfort zone.
Right.
Mainly driven by food prices.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing core inflation going up.
Right, which excludes the volatile stuff like food and energy.
Exactly.
So that means price pressures are becoming more broad-based,
Interesting.
potentially signaling the RBI might have to keep monetary policy tighter for longer.
To get inflation back in check.
Exactly.
So for those prepping for the exam,
yes.
understanding those nuances of inflation and how it affects monetary policy,
Uh-huh.
it's critical.
Definitely.
Okay, let's move on to something that can be a little confusing.
Okay.
Exchange rates.
All right.
The article talks about a suite of approaches for estimating equilibrium exchange rates for India.
Sounds complicated.
I'm already lost.
Well, it's not as bad as it sounds.
Okay.
Basically, they're looking at 3 ways to figure out what the rupee's equilibrium value should be.
Okay.
Beer, peer, and fear.
Beer, peer, fear.
Yeah, they almost sound like drinks you'd order at a pub.
I was just thinking that. What do they actually mean, though?
Right, so beer stands for Behavioral Equilibrium Exchange Rate.
Okay.
Peer is Permanent Equilibrium Exchange Rate.
Got it.
And fear is Fundamental Equilibrium Exchange Rate.
So each model looks at different things that affect the rupee's value.
Exactly. It's like looking at the same problem from different angles.
So it's not about finding one right value for the rupee.
No.
It's more about understanding where it should be based on all these different factors.
Precisely.
The article talks about things like how productive different countries are, trade dynamics,
Yeah.
how much foreign assets are held, even government fiscal policies.
All of that plays into where the rupee stands against other currencies.
That makes sense.
It does.
But why should our listeners prepping for the RBI Grade B exam care about these models?
Well, they're not just theoretical. You know, they actually give policymakers a framework, including those at the RBI, to analyze whether the rupee is overvalued, undervalued,
Oh, interesting.
or right where it should be.
And that's important for managing the exchange rate.
It is.
which then affects things like trade, capital flows,
Mhm.
the whole economy. Really. Wow, so understanding these models could really be a game changer for those tackling the RBI Grade B exam.
It could.
It's not just memorizing definition.
No.
It's about understanding how these concepts are used in real life.
To analyze and shape economic policy.
So important.
And speaking of the RBI's influence,
Yes. Let's talk about how they communicate.
let's do it.
This next article is fascinating.
It is.
It's like they put the RBI's words under a microscope.
That's a great way to put it.
They use something called natural language processing,
Or NLP for short.
NLP.
Yeah.
I'll admit, that sounds a bit intimidating.
Well, think of it this way.
Okay.
It's basically teaching computers to understand human language.
Huh.
Like really understand it.
Okay.
So they can analyze it.
So in this case,
Yes.
they used NLP to study the tone and focus of what the RBI has been saying over time.
Exactly. Like decoding how they talk about the economy.
So they're like analyzing their communication style.
That's it.
What do they...
Well, one interesting thing is that the RBI's communication style actually changes
Really?
depending on what's happening in the economy.
Wow.
Like their tone and the topics they emphasized during the pandemic were quite different from what they focused on during the Ukraine conflict.
So they adapt their language to the situation.
Exactly. It's strategic.
But why is that so important?
Because it shows how the RBI uses language to manage expectations and influence how the market behaves.
Wow.
Think about it. The way they talk about inflation,
Yeah.
that can impact consumer confidence, investment decisions.
And even the rupee.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how much power their words have.
They do.
It makes me realize that mastering the language of economics, it's not just about passing an exam.
No.
It's about understanding how communication shapes the entire economy.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about the global economic tightrope walk, the complexities of exchange rates, and the power of the RBI's words. Now let's turn our attention to a sector that's buzzing with innovation. Agri-tech. This article on agri-tech startups and innovations in Indian agriculture really stood out to me. It's incredible how technology is changing the face of agriculture. What are your initial thoughts on this?
Well, I think what's most fascinating is how agri-tech is bridging this gap between traditional farming practices and cutting-edge technology. The article highlights this surge in investor interest, especially after the pandemic.
Yeah.
Venture capital is pouring into the sector. It's clear that people see the potential of agri-tech to revolutionize Indian agriculture.
It's definitely a space to watch and makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what specific innovations are we talking about?
Right.
What's happening on the ground?
Well, the article points to e-commerce as a major player.
Okay.
You've got these platforms connecting farmers directly to consumers.
Cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. Better prices for both sides.
Makes sense.
We're also seeing innovations in things like precision farming,
Precision farming.
using technology to optimize resource use,
Wow.
and data analytics to improve decision-making.
That's impressive.
It is.
But let's be realistic.
Right.
Every sector has its challenges.
Of course.
What kind of hurdles are these agri-tech startups facing?
Well, the article brings up the issue of fragmented land holdings in India.
Right.
That makes it hard to implement some technologies.
Yeah, if you need those larger consolidated plots,
Exactly.
and then there's the longer time it takes for these startups to start making money.
Compared to, say, a software company
Right.
that can make it tough to attract and keep investors.
So despite all the excitement and potential,
Yeah.
it's not all smooth sailing.
Definitely not.
But the government's taking notice, right?
They are.
The article mentions government funding, RD initiatives,
Yeah.
investments in digital infrastructure.
It's all about creating a better environment for agri-tech to flourish.
Sounds like a collaborative effort is needed. It does. For agri-tech to really take off.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about something a bit more cyclical.
Okay.
Seasonality in key economic indicators.
Interesting.
This article caught my eye because it reminds us that economics isn't just about these abstract numbers.
Right.
It's tied to the real world with its seasons and cycles.
I like that.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a fascinating perspective.
Yeah.
The article really delves into how various economic indicators in India, they exhibit distinct seasonal patterns.
Like that classic example of vegetable prices going up during monsoon season.
Exactly. Supply disruptions.
Everyone's experienced that.
For sure.
What other kind of seasonal patterns did they find?
Well, they looked at a huge range of indicators.
Okay.
Money supply, industrial production, trade, even rainfall.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is.
Anything particularly interesting?
Well, they found that fruit prices actually peak during the summer months.
Opposite of vegetables.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Another thing, industrial production usually peaks in March.
Makes sense.
But consumer durables see a surge in October.
Oh, right, with the festive season.
Exactly.
It's like the economy has its own calendar.
It does.
Peaks and valleys throughout the year.
That's a good way to put it.
But why is it important to understand these seasonal patterns?
Well, for one,
Yeah.
it lets us see past those short-term fluctuations and identify the real underlying trends in the economy.
So for someone trying to ace the RBI Grade B exam,
Yes.
understanding these nuances, it's crucial for analyzing economic data accurately.
And for making good policy decisions.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for the economy.
I like that.
Before we wrap up part one,
Okay.
let's leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Right.
How could understanding these seasonal trends give you an edge? Not just in the RBI Grade B exam,
Yeah.
but also in understanding the Indian economy as a whole.
Great question.
We'll dig into that more in part two.
Looking forward to it.
So stay tuned.
Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to our deep dive into the November 2024 RBI Bulletin. Before the break, we left you with a question
Oh, right.
about those seasonal economic trends. How understanding them could help you, not just with the exam, but with understanding the Indian economy in general.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Well, I was thinking about how easy it is to get caught up in the headlines about prices going up or down.
Yeah.
But when you understand that some of that is just seasonal,
Right.
it helps you see the bigger picture.
It does.
It's like, ice cream sales go up in the summer.
Of course.
Doesn't mean the economy's booming.
Right.
It's just the weather.
Exactly. Part of a natural cycle.
Yeah.
And for those prepping for the RBI Grade B exam, that ability to see past the seasonal noise and get to the real trends, that's crucial.
Super important.
Imagine you're looking at data on agricultural output.
Okay.
And you see a dip in production in one quarter.
Yeah.
If you don't factor in the monsoon season,
Wow.
you might misinterpret that dip.
Like it's a problem with the sector itself.
Exactly.
When it's really just part of the natural cycle.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
It's like having this extra layer of understanding
Yeah.
helps you interpret the data more accurately.
Precisely.
Okay, let's go back to agri-tech for a minute.
All right.
We were talking about the challenges they face,
Yeah.
but the article also mentioned that the government is stepping in to help them grow.
They are.
Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The government recognizes the potential of agri-tech to transform Indian agriculture.
Yeah.
And they're actively supporting its development.
What kind of things are they doing?
Well, the article mentions things like dedicated funding schemes
Okay.
for agri-tech startups.
To help them get off the ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're promoting research and development.
In agricultural technologies.
Yes.
Interesting.
And investing in digital infrastructure.
Oh, to bridge the connectivity gap in rural areas.
That's a big one.
It is.
It's a multifaceted approach.
Makes sense, given how complex agriculture is in India.
It does.
What about the RBI? What role do you see for them in supporting agri-tech?
That's a great question.
I mean, their main focus is monetary policy and financial stability, right?
It is, but they can still play a role.
An indirect role.
Exactly.
Okay.
For instance, they can promote financial inclusion in rural areas.
So farmers and agri-tech startups can get access to credit more easily.
Precisely.
Interesting.
They could also encourage banks to create financial products.
Specifically for the agri-tech sector.
Exactly. Tailored to their needs.
That's a good point.
It shows how, even though the RBI isn't directly involved in agriculture,
Right.
their policies can still have a big impact.
On the whole economy.
Yes, even sectors like agri-tech.
Okay, let's shift gears again.
All right.
Back to those exchange rate models.
Okay.
You said they give policymakers a framework, but can you give us a real-world example?
Of how they might use one of these models.
Exactly.
Sure.
Okay.
Let's take the beer model.
Beer.
Behavioral equilibrium exchange rate.
Right.
This model considers a bunch of factors.
Mm-hmm.
Productivity growth differences between countries.
Okay.
Trade patterns, capital flows.
Got it.
So let's say the RBI is trying to figure out
Yeah.
if the rupee is valued correctly right now.
Okay.
They could use the beer model.
To estimate the equilibrium exchange rate.
Exactly. Based on current economic conditions.
And then if the actual exchange rate is way off from that estimate.
Then it might mean the rupee is overvalued or undervalued.
So it's a way for them to check if the market is reflecting the rupee's true value.
Precisely.
And that's important for making policy decisions.
Absolutely.
Like, if the beer model says the rupee is overvalued,
Yeah.
the RBI might intervene in the foreign exchange market to prevent the rupee from appreciating further.
Which could hurt exports.
Right.
And if the rupee is undervalued,
They might let it depreciate.
gradually to boost exports.
That's really helpful.
Glad to hear it. It makes it much clearer how these models are used in practice.
It does.
And I can definitely see how understanding this stuff would be beneficial for the RBI Grade B exam.
For sure.
But it's not just about the exam, is it?
No, not at all.
Understanding these models can also help us make sense of the news,
Absolutely.
analyze economic development,
It's a framework for thinking about exchange rates.
which are always in the news.
All the time.
So the next time you see a headline
Mm-hmm.
about the rupee hitting a new high or low,
Yeah.
you'll have a better understanding of what's going on.
And what it might mean for the economy.
It's like having a decoder ring for economic news. Now, earlier you mentioned how the RBI uses language strategically
Oh, right.
to manage expectations
Yep.
and influence market behavior.
Yeah.
That really got me thinking.
It is fascinating
Can you give us some specific examples?
of how the RBI's communication can impact the markets.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay.
Remember that article that used natural language processing?
To analyze the RBI's statements.
Yeah.
I do.
One of the findings was that the tone and focus of their communication
Yeah.
can really affect financial markets.
How so?
Well, imagine the RBI says in their policy statement
Okay.
that they're worried about inflation,
Uh-huh.
and they hint at raising interest rates.
Okay.
That could trigger a sell-off in the bond market
Really? Why?
because investors anticipate lower bond prices.
Wow. So even subtle changes in their language can have a big impact.
They can.
It's like a chain reaction.
It is.
That really highlights the responsibility the RBI has
It does.
to communicate effectively.
Absolutely.
Because a poorly worded statement or a confusing signal
Mm-hmm.
could create uncertainty in the markets.
Yeah.
And that can have real consequences.
For businesses, investors,
It's a reminder that words have power,
they do.
especially when spoken by institutions like the RBI.
Especially them.
So for our RBI Grade B exam hopefuls,
Yeah.
this means it's not just about understanding economic theory.
Right.
It's also about developing a good sense.
Of how communication shapes policy and impacts the markets.
I agree.
It's about seeing how everything is connected.
Uh-huh.
The data, the policy decisions.
The communication strategies,
Yes.
and ultimately how it all affects the real economy.
Exactly.
Wow, we've covered a lot in part two.
Why have?
Government support for agri-tech,
Mm-hmm.
how exchange rate models are used, and the power of the RBI's communication.
A lot of ground.
But there's still more to unpack
Oh, there is.
in the November 2024 RBI Bulletin.
Definitely.
So in part 3, we'll discuss some key takeaways
Okay.
and how these insights can be applied.
Sounds good.
Not just for those who want to join the RBI,
Right.
but for anyone who wants to understand the Indian economy better.
Looking forward to it.
Stay with us. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the November 2024 RBI Bulletin. We've covered so much.
We have, from global economics to the RBI's communication style.
So much insight in just one bulletin.
It's really impressive.
But now, let's talk about what our listeners can take away from all of this,
Yeah, the applications.
especially for those prepping for the RBI Grade B exam.
Right.
How can this knowledge give them an edge?
I think the key is to go beyond just memorizing facts
Okay.
and really understand the concepts we've talked about.
So deeper understanding,
It
because
is.
the exam is about more than just recalling information.
It is. It's about showing you can think analytically.
Apply those economic principles to real-world situations.
Precisely.
So it's not enough to know what the beer model is.
No.
You need to be able to explain how policymakers actually use it.
To assess the rupee's value, for example.
Exactly.
And that goes for all the topics we've covered.
Yeah.
You might be asked to analyze how a global slowdown would affect India's monetary policy.
Or evaluate the effectiveness of government initiatives in agri-tech.
It's all about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture.
Showing you can think critically about economic issues.
And don't forget communication.
Oh,
The exam often has questions where you need to explain things clearly and concisely.
so paying attention to how the RBI communicates
Like we discussed earlier,
can actually help with the exam.
it's like learning from the best.
What about those who aren't taking the exam, though?
Yeah, what about them?
How can this deep dive be useful for them?
Well, I think the main takeaway for everyone
Yeah.
is that economics is all around us.
It's not just some abstract thing in a textbook.
Exactly.
Understanding basic economic concepts can help us make better decisions.
In so many areas of life.
Investing, starting a business, even just understanding the news.
Absolutely, like knowing about seasonal trends.
Helps you understand why prices